I've been roasting coffee on this coffee roaster for months now together with my wife, Sarah. It's a fantastic roaster. We love using it. We were getting great results with it. But then we flicked one button on it and everything got noticeably better. More predictable, more consistent, easier to use even. And what that button does is actually really simple. All it does is it changes the direction that the beans are spinning around inside the drum. Sounds like it shouldn't matter at all, but it does. And exploring what was making the difference here changed a lot about how I actually think about roasting coffee. Some quick context here. My wife Sarah and I, we run a very small roasting company based in Ontario, Canada. We have a lot of coffee experience, but we're, I'm going to say, novice coffee roasters. We roast on the Roest Ultra, which is a very technology-forward coffee roaster. Now, they're based in Norway, and we really like the approach that they take to coffee roasting. It's very precise, loaded with sensors, very repeatable, all that. And we use it for quality control, evaluating and selecting green coffee samples. And honestly, because we're still quite new and small, we're using this for a lot of our production coffee roasting. So if you're in Canada and you've ordered a bag of coffee from us, this is what it was roasted on. Now, for our first couple months with this thing, we used it in standard rotation mode. How it comes, how the first profiles are loaded onto it. You can select one of a couple different profiles. You load your coffee in the top, it goes into the drum, the hot air goes in, and the coffee gets roasted. And the results were great. But there's this other mode that it has that we didn't try, and it's called Counterflow Mode. So, I had read a lot about this. There wasn't a lot of profiles designed for this mode at that time, but I figured, we should try it. And once we tried it and we found our groove with it, we couldn't go back to what we were doing before. And here was what was really actually kind of cool about that whole process is it forced me to think about something when it comes to coffee roasting that I wasn't actually processing before. And that is how the heat is actually getting taken up by the coffee beans matters just as much as how much heat you are actually applying in the first place. So here's what's happening inside and how it impacts the flavor of roasting coffee. And I want to keep this pretty simple. A coffee roaster generally puts hot air into a drum full of beans. Now that drum can either spin on its own or it can have things inside that move the beans around inside the drum. That's basically roasting. That's it. The beans get agitated so that they roast evenly and completely. And at its core, it's not actually a whole lot more complicated than that. Now in standard mode, the paddles inside the drum are spinning in one direction. You can see they're actually spinning this way. The drum's right here in this roaster. There's this little window that looks into the drum, and you can actually see the paddles moving around in there. And when the beans go in there, you can see them kind of lifting up and then falling back down. Now in here, the air inlet is actually over on this side. So the air is going in, the beans are on the other side of the drum, the air blows over them and heats up the environment, slowly roasting the beans. Counterflow flips that around. And I think it's best just to show you. So I'm gonna put the coffee in here and I'll open the gate to let the beans into the drum. And you can see the drum changes direction and the paddles actually start turning the other way. Now when that setting is turned on and the machine is running in counterflow mode, you can see the beans aren't actually right in front of this window. They're pushed over by the paddles over onto this side of the drum. And when that happens, the air coming in through the inlet is actually blowing right through the pile of beans rather than over top of it. And this is kind of important about this. It's not just about which direction the paddles are spinning the beans in there. It's the combination of the direction, the placement of where the beans are in the roaster itself, as well as the specific geometry inside the drum and where the inlet is. All of that combines so that when you flip the direction of the rotation, the dynamics of how the beans are heated change actually pretty drastically inside there. You can kind of think of this like a clothes dryer. If the dryer is set up to kind of just blow hot air over the top of the pile of tumbling clothes, you're going to need to use a lot more hot air to actually get the clothes dry. Versus if hot air is actually blowing through the pile of tumbling clothes, they're going to dry a lot more quickly and you won't need to use as much heat. And this is actually how Roest's production roaster, the P3000, works as well. It's actually designed around this whole principle. Their sample roasters were actually designed to initially work with standard rotation, and then they kind of added this on as a mode. Whereas the P3000 is designed to work that way, sort of primarily. But the real question is, if all it's doing differently is pushing hot air through the coffee instead of over top of it, why does that actually make the coffee taste better? You know, I spent actually a long time trying to think about this and trying to figure out why this was. And I asked the Roest team their take too. And I think the actual answer is a lot simpler in some ways than you might expect. There's not actually a lot of magic going on. It's kind of a simple process, really. There are two main ways that a coffee bean heats up when it's inside a roaster. And you can kind of think about cooking because it's sort of a similar thing. There's two ways to cook a piece of meat, you know, a chicken or steak or whatever. You can hit it with heat hard in like a cast iron pan, sear the outside and keep going until it's done. The outside cooks and caramelizes very quickly, and then the inside of the meat needs to catch up. Or you can cook it in an oven. Hot air surrounds the whole thing and the piece of meat cooks very evenly. Both methods will cook your chicken. But each method will have a very different result and a very different taste. Now, in coffee, these methods of heating and anything actually, they have different names. The hot pan method is called conduction, you know, direct contact with a hot surface, surface to surface. The oven method is called convection, everything heating up ambiently at kind of the same rate. Every drum coffee roaster uses a little bit of both. The drum walls get hot, that's conduction. You also have air flowing through there, that's convection. The question is always, what is the ratio between those two things? And here's the insight to all this. When you force more air directly through the pile of coffee, which is what counterflow does, you can roast at significantly lower heat levels and still get the exact same result when it comes to the final roast level. The beans get the same total energy, they're just getting it more efficiently, and they don't really care where that heat came from. A side effect of that, though, is because you can use lower heat levels to get the same result when it comes to the roast level, the drum walls are actually a little bit cooler as well. Cooler drum walls mean less conduction. So you're kind of tipping the balance a little bit in favor of convection over conduction. You're getting more of that gentle heat, which translates into the, I feel like anyways, better taste. More open tasting notes in the coffee, more even development, less harshness. Not that the roasts we were getting before were poor, but I feel like it's just better this way. There's also a couple other things that are kind of cool about this mode. When I was doing standard rotation mode in this roaster, just with the way it's designed with the outlet up here, I found that every so often with a larger batch, beans would get knocked up and kind of land in the exhaust area and need to be cleaned out periodically. I don't find that happens at all with Counterflow mode. So you can do a larger batch a little bit more comfortably. I also noticed a couple things when I was looking at the roasting curves. You know, when you're roasting coffee, there's something called an ROR curve. That's a rate of rise. So it kind of shows you at what rate the bean temperature is rising. And as you're roasting, you can infer a lot of things by the shape of that curve. And in Counterflow mode, I just found that how that curve looked was a lot more predictable. Beans reacted a lot more like I expected them to. There were fewer surprises. And, you know, this may be experience a little bit as well, but I found that when I used those counterflow profiles, I was taking a little bit of a shorter path to a guaranteed good result. Now, I asked the Roest team why that might be. And, you know, I'll be honest, they said, you know, this could just be as simple as when it's in counterflow mode, you know, the bean temperature sensor for that drum rotation is in a slightly different spot, and maybe it just is taking a slightly better reading. of beans in that spot. But what I will say is the taste difference is real. I would try and get as close to a same final result on the roast of different specific beans that I was using in both standard and counterflow mode and blind. Every time, both Sarah and I, we would pick the counterflow rotation roast as our preferred profile for any given coffee. So, even if there's other things at play, it was really cool to see how that difference actually played out in the cup and to get a little bit of a more holistic understanding of how heat is applied inside a roaster. Now, one other thing that I do want to mention is throughout this whole process, I didn't just play with the heat. I also played with the airflow, which you can play with by adjusting the fan speed. And that also has a really big impact on how beans take up heat. So if you're getting into this, my only advice, I feel like I could spend a whole video on just this topic, but you really want to be thinking about how heat and airflow work in concert. You don't want to just isolate one and ignore the other. My experience overall was if you added more airflow, you also needed to add a little bit more heat to the system because the heat is evacuating more quickly. Now, when it comes to counterflow mode specifically, I think the key is that it doesn't just change the direction of the beans rotating inside the drum. It changes the ratio of the type of heat that the beans are taking up from the roaster. Now, if you don't roast your own coffee, why does any of this matter? Maybe it's interesting, but is it applicable? Here's what it taught me. When somebody says light roasted coffee or dark roasted coffee, basically you're thinking about one thing. Dark roasted coffee gets more heat, light roasted coffee gets less heat. But how the heat is actually applied puts this whole other axis on the conversation. You can have two different coffee roasters roasting the exact same coffee, even to the same color level, and you can get two very, very different results in the cup. And one of the biggest reasons for that is the difference of the ratio between conduction and convection. And if you zoom way out on this whole conversation, and this is true not just for roasting equipment, this is true for any kind of equipment. It's easy to get sucked into specs and think more of this, more of that. Sometimes just by optimizing what you have in front of you, you can really tweak the results of what you're doing, be it you're roasting or you're brewing, in some pretty surprising ways, really. So I'm going to do a couple things here. This is a real overarching look on principles and how roasters work in general form. So if you're a roast user and you say even have an Ultra and you want to try a profile, I'll drop a kind of base profile. It's really simple that I got from another Ultra user. That's Reese from Central Coast Coffee in Australia. This offers a very easy entry point if you're an Ultra user into the world of counterflow. I got pretty good results almost from the get-go without any major modifications to this profile, and it's dead simple. So you can try that, mess with it, see how you get on with it. I'll also leave a link to the unofficial Roast Discord. There's a really great community of users there. If you own one of these things, would highly recommend jumping into that community. I kind of lurk on the sidelines there and have learned a lot from that group as well. One thing I will say is if you try and migrate from using standard profiles into counterflow and you just kind of flip the switch on an existing profile, it won't necessarily translate very well. So there is a little bit of a learning curve here. Also, one really quick note that I do want to mention, you might have noticed I got a little bit of buildup here in the window. When you're in standard mode, the beans kind of rub against this whole window. But when you're in counterflow, they don't. And you can get a little bit of buildup in here over time. Now, there isn't like a best practice for cleaning that part. So I reached out to the Roest team and they're going to consider adding that. They suggested in the meantime, I just run a couple standard rotation roasts in there to see if it will clean up that window. It's minor, but I wanted to mention it. I do add that they added persistent dark mode. So every time you turn it on though, it's in your dark mode. I like that a lot. But for us with our roastery project Got Coffee Co., the counterflow mode is basically our mode of operation at this point, and I don't really see it changing anytime soon. Now, in terms of who this roaster is for, the Ultra is truly a pro grade sample roaster. This is kind of at the top end of both the price and the feature set when it comes to roasters of this size. And I think even if you aren't looking at this roaster specifically, getting a deeper understanding of those principles of airflow, conduction, convection, trying to mess with different ratios of how the heat is getting applied to beans is something that can have a pretty dramatic impact on the taste of your coffee. You know, we're almost 1,000 roasts in on this thing, and we're going to do a recap when we get to that point. So stay tuned for a 1,000 roasts video. For those of you who do roast at home, I'd love to know how you mess with your roast settings. I hope your next cup of coffee is fantastic, and we'll see you on the next one.